Hi, everyone, and welcome to our first masterclass in the series of how to learn like a pro. First off, this webinar is indeed being recorded and we will share the recording with you guys afterwards. Also, don't worry if you have to drop out at any point. Like I said, we'll send you the recording and you'll be able to pick up in the next session next week at any point. So let's get started with a bit of housekeeping before the actual main event. First off, if you have any questions, just add it in the Q&A panel right here on Zoom. You're more than welcome to chat amongst yourself as you're already doing in the chat. Don't forget to change the chat settings to if you want to talk to panelists and attendees. Otherwise, only me and our lovely co-host Olav will be able to see your chat. So be able to chat with everyone. Make sure to change it to panelists and attendees. And I see there's people from Texas, Dubai, India, New Jersey, Singapore, Brazil. This is amazing. We're like all over the world. From Peru, Oxford, UK. Awesome. I'm coming to you live from Oslo in Norway, as well as our lovely co-host, and that is Olav Schewe. And he is a learning expert, author, and public speaker. So take it away, Olav, and welcome.
All right, thank you for that. Let me get my screen shared. So very excited to talk to you all about how to learn better today. To give you a little bit of my background, I am from Norway, which is very close to the Arctic, and it looks like that here as well. And I like to take advantage of that. But I've also always been very interested in exploring and going new places and just learning. So I've been working or studying from many different locations around the world. And after several years of working and studying in different places, my interest turned more to how to learn instead of learning new things. How can we improve the way we learn? So I wrote a book called Super Student, which was a guide for students on how to learn effectively. And that has become an international bestseller, now translated to 21 languages. After that, my interest shifted a little bit more towards how to help others become better at learning, and also towards more professionals and people in working in different industries. And so for that, I've partnered up with Dr. Barbara Oakley from the US. And for the last few years, we have been working together with extracting the best insights from neuroscience and cognitive psychology for learning. And we put all of that together in our book, Learn Like a Pro, which was released on June 1st. And we've also put all of those insights into an online course released on edX, also called Learn Like a Pro. And what I will be doing today and also next week is to present some of the best insights from this. So what does it take to become really great at something? Well, a professor at UC Berkeley has been working with that for several years. And in one of his surveys, he asked 5,000 employees and managers all kinds of different questions. And what he found was that high performance individually generally always looks for ways to learn and to improve, whereas low performance individuals do not. And of course, we all know that learning and continuously learning is important to being effective at work and in what we do. But what we perhaps don't spend so much time on is how we should do this, how we should learn effectively, or how we should learn like a pro. So let's just dig into it. Today, we're going to start with seeing what happens in your long-term memory when you learn. We're going to look at the neuroscience. After that, we will be looking at some learning techniques that you can use. And then we will be looking at some even more advanced techniques that you can use. So if you've been on a webinar with me before, these first two parts might be a little bit of a recap for you, but hopefully there will be lots of new and interesting insights for everyone. But we'll start with looking at what happens in your brain when you learn. And if we want to understand learning, we have to understand the neurons. The neurons are tiny, tiny cells in your brain, and you can think of them as your brain's building blocks. And you have many, many such neurons, approximately 86 billion of them. And you can think of these neurons as some kind of creature. It has a body, and then sticking up from that body is an arm, or in neuroscience, it's called an axon. And this creature also have lots of legs, which are called dendrites. And on those legs, you can see a lot of small spines sticking out. You can think of those as toes. Now, these neurons in your brain, they connect with one another all the time. And the way that they do that is by reaching out their arm and putting their finger as close as possible to the toe of another neuron. And then to communicate with one another, neurons send electrical signals. So an electrical signal will travel out through the arm of a neuron, and then it will kind of jump over to the toe of the next neuron and continue up the leg. And just like that, an electrical signal can travel from one neuron to the next, etc. And what happens when you learn something new is that many such neurons, they come together and they form a set of links. And the knowledge that you've learned, or the skill, is then stored in this set of links. So if you've been to Scandinavia, you might have been to the capital of Denmark, or maybe you know the capital of Denmark even without having been there. So if I ask you what the capital of Denmark is, and the right answer sort of just pops up or comes to mind, you are activating the sets of links in your brain where this knowledge is stored. And in case you're wondering, Copenhagen is the capital of Denmark. It's like that for everything. When you think of something you've learned, then that electrical signal will travel along these sets of links. But what do you think happens if this set of links break up? Well, in that case, you forget what you initially learned. So to learn something well, to make sure that it lasts or it sticks in your long-term memory, you have to create very strong sets of links that don't easily break up. Ideally, these links should be as strong as a chain. Then you've learned something really, really well. And if you can create these strong neural chains in your long-term memory, and you can connect them to other sets of links in your long-term memory, that's when you develop a deep understanding, and you can see how everything is connected. So let's give you a small activity now. According to research, which of the following four techniques is the most powerful for learning? Is it rereading, that is reading information more than once? Is it highlighting and underlining the information that you read? Is it retrieval practice, also called recall or self-testing? Or is it creating concept maps, such as the one you can see here on the screen? Let's do a small poll here. And there, it should be popping up on your screen. So just select the alternative that you think is best for learning according to research. We have about 70% now that have answered this question. All right, and we will close this in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last chance. 0 and all right. And let me share the results with you. So as you can see, around most people answered either retrieval practice or creating concept maps. And concept maps can be a very powerful tool to organize knowledge and to become aware of connections between knowledge. But research is pretty clear on that the best way to make information stick and to learn it really well is retrieval practice. And the reason for that is that every time you learn something initially, it creates a weak set of links, be that through reading something or watching a video, etc. But every time that you retrieve that, that is taking that knowledge out again from your long-term memory. For example, by testing yourself, discussing it with others, or teaching it. Every time you do that, it strengthens that links and just makes it stronger and stronger and stronger. And if we want to understand why, we should go back to these neurons and look at the connection points between the different neurons. If you say reread information or you look at information, that activates that knowledge too, but the electrical signal that is sent is quite weak. So it doesn't do much to strengthen the connection that you have there. But every time you retrieve that information, you have to actively seek it out and use it. It sends a much more powerful electrical signal. And this electrical signal actually makes the toe and the finger of the neuron grow larger and closer to one another. And this is what characterizes a strong connection between two neurons. So retrieval practice is often called one of the most powerful techniques for learning in cognitive psychology. And there's many ways to use it. If you are a learner, then try to use what you've learned as much as possible, discuss it with others, teach others, etc. And if you are helping other people learn, give them ample opportunity to retrieve that from their own memory. For example, by using tests or quizzes such as the Kahoot tool. And let's do a little retrieval practice right now. So I'll ask you a question from something I presented a little bit earlier, but I've made a twist, so I made it a little bit hard, but I'm curious to see how well you do. So we talked about neurons being your brain's building blocks, but how many neurons do you have in your brain? Let's see if you can retrieve that from your own memory. Very interesting. You guys are doing quite well. I'm impressed. We have around 69% have answered so far. We'll give it another 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and we'll end it. So the twist, of course, to this was that none of these numbers that I showed you were actually in my presentation. What I showed was that you have approximately 86 billion neurons, which is around 100 billion. And most of you got that correct. So very well done. All right, let's stop sharing this. Now, another thing that can threaten the connections between the neurons in these sets of links is a cleaning process that your brain does every night when you sleep. If there's knowledge that you've only learned one day and then not use consequently, your brain might opt to just rid itself of the toes involved in that set of links. So here you can see a connection point between two neurons, and this might be part of a set of links where some knowledge is stored. But if you only learn that on one day, there's a big chance that a few nights later, your brain will do some cleansing, get rid of some of the toes, and then the toe involved in that connection is gone, and the whole chain breaks up. One easy thing that you can do to avoid this is to space your learning out over several days and to ensure that you have a little bit of sleep in between your learning, because that will do the opposite. Instead of risking that this toe will disappear, your brain will continue to strengthen it. And actually, if you have been learning something over several days, the neurons involved there will get additional toes on them, and your brain creates these additional toes so that it becomes easier for you to connect even more neurons to this sets of links, so that you can create these intertwined webs of knowledge that characterizes deep understanding. So inducing sleep into your learning is actually very powerful, and we can observe this in a microscope. So here you can see a living neuron. It's the leg of the neuron, and all the small things sticking out are the toes. And then there's a session of learning and a night of sleep. And the next morning, we can see that there's many new toes that have grown out from this leg. So to learn something really well, you should not only learn it on one day, but you should continue to work with it over several days. That will create these strong sets of links. If you instead only sit on one day and mass your time into that one day, it's better to spend a lot of time in a way on one day than spend little time on one day, but it's much better to break it out over several days, because that time you spend in on multiple repetitions on one day actually doesn't do much to strengthen your links, and they might just wither away. And in a way, there's a lot of parallels between learning something well and building muscles. Now, to become strong, you have to work over time. The cells in your muscles have to grow stronger, and you cannot do that within a day or within a weekend. And it's somewhat similar with learning too. The best learning happens when it's spread over several days and you give it some time. So if you have 3 hours to spend a week, instead of spending only 3 hours in one session, try to do 1 hour on 3 different days. Spacing out your learning is also one of the oldest and most robust, techniques that you can use for learning something better. All right, let's then move into something a little bit more advanced. Dopamine is often associated with motivation, and it's a molecule that's released in your brain when you are motivated. It gives you that energy to pursue goals. It's also released whenever you experience something very positive. You get a reward or a compliment from somebody. It makes you feel good. If you win an amount on the slot machine or on a lottery, dopamine is released, and it gives you that warm and good feeling. And of course, researchers have known for a very long time that motivation is important for learning. Because when you are motivated and you have these high dopamine levels, then you will spend more time, you will be more focused, and both of those will help you learn something better. But more recently, researchers have also found that dopamine can play a more direct role in learning, not only indirectly through making sure you spend a lot of time and attention learning. And dopamine plays an especially important role in helping you learn when you're curious about something. Because if you are curious, you want to learn something, and that curiosity is then satisfied, meaning the questions that you had is answered, or you learned what you want to learn, then dopamine is also released. But this dopamine doesn't only make you feel good because you learned something. This dopamine, it also travels right into your long-term memory, where you are creating these sets of links. And it goes directly into the toes. And it there works as a sort of strengthener to help strengthen the connections. So to learn something better, it's very powerful to be curious, or to try to induce or unleash your curiosity in that learning. And of course, there's been research around for quite a few years that we can now make sense of and understand, and that we can now understand better. For example, in some very old research, mice were learning to find their way through a maze. And some mice were just let to themselves to roam around in this maze, and they could get familiar with it. Of course, they would make a lot of detours on the way until they understood what the fastest way through the maze was. So researchers thought that to speed up this process, they would help the mice by putting in barriers on all the wrong turns so that the mice would repeatedly walk through the maze in the most efficient way. And of course, it was quite straightforward for these mice to go through the maze. But then once the researchers took out these barriers, they saw that the mice that had been walking around this always through the most efficient way, they were now completely clueless, and they got lost and they couldn't really find their way. They hadn't really learned the maze very well. Whereas those who had been roaming around on their own, letting their curiosity take them either right or left, they had really understood this maze and could find their way through it much faster. There's also been research around for quite a long time that has shown that if you are reading something, you'll remember more from what you read if you beforehand have some questions that you want to get answered. A good way to get a little bit of extra mileage out of the time that you spend learning is to awaken that curiosity in you. Try to come up with reason why something is interesting or valuable to learn. Finding out what you want to learn and letting that curiosity drive you. And if you're helping others learn, you can use this too by asking questions, creating a fascination, awakening that curiosity in those learners. Because that will help dopamine release in your brain, which will go directly to these links and strengthen learning. Okay, so we've been talking about how to create these strong sets of links in your long-term memory. What I haven't mentioned yet is that there are two different systems that you can use to create these strong sets of links. There's actually also two different locations in your long-term memory where these links get stored. One system that you can use for learning is the declarative system. That system starts in your working memory. So your working memory is a part of the brain where you can hold information temporarily. If you are multiplying 8 times 14 in your head, you'll be using your working memory. If you're trying to remember a shopping list or a phone number, you'll be using your working memory. It works on a very short time scale. So if you learn something declaratively, it first goes through your working memory, then it goes through a part of your brain known as the hippocampus, and then into your long-term memory. But there's also another way to get information into long-term memory, and that's the procedural system. And that works a little bit differently. That can also start with your working memory, but your working memory plays a much smaller role. It only initiates things. And then it goes through another structure called the basal ganglia. And procedural information and declarative information or skills have different characteristics. So things that you learn declaratively, or when you're learning something declaratively, you're mostly conscious of it. So for example, if you're sitting in a classroom or you're taking a course, you know that you are learning something. But you might also just have a very fascinating conversation with someone. You're talking about all kinds of stuff and you're learning something, but you're not thinking about that as an explicit learning situation. Then it's more procedural. And declarative learning, that typically develops through explicit instruction, whereas procedural learning, that develops through practice. Whatever you learn declaratively, you can typically explain. What you've learned procedurally, you cannot very easily explain. So maybe you know how to solve some algebra problems in mathematics, and you can do it, but you struggle to explain it, then you've learned it procedurally. Or if you have, or for example, take tying your shoes. You know how to do it, but it's very hard to explain exactly what you're doing. That's because it's learned procedurally. Declarative learning generally involves sequential tasks, so something you could draw out in a diagram, whereas procedural learning typically involves much more complex patterns. And here comes perhaps the most important distinction between these two. Declarative learning is very fast, it can be very fast, so you can learn it quite quickly, but it's slow to use. Whereas procedural learning is the other way around. It takes a lot of time to learn, but once you've learned it, it's quite fast to use. So say, for example, that you are learning a foreign language and someone tells you some useful rules in grammar that you can use to conjugate the verb, or maybe someone gives you a funny rule or a mental image that you can do to remember a word. So you have a good sort of a good rule for remembering something, and it was quite fast to use it. But when you're out there on the street talking to a foreigner, you really have to think a little bit to retrieve that word. Whereas if you are just immersed in a language and you speak it every day, you don't get explicit instruction, you are just immersed in the experience, it might take a little bit longer time to learn a word because there's so many different words, etc. But once you've learned it, it's quite fast to use. So you can then speak much more fluently. And it's the same with driving too. You might learn some principles for driving quite quickly. For example, that you should put on the blinker when you turn. You should keep a certain distance to the car in front of you. But when you're using these principles actively, typically in the beginning when you're learning to drive, you have to think a lot and your brain is very hard at work. Whereas after a while, when you've been driving for a long time, you can drive much more effortlessly, and it's quite fast and easy to do things. And that's because you've developed a lot of procedural links. And declarative learning, the advantage of that is that it's quite flexible. So you can, it's easy to change something. You can correct the mistake. Whereas if you learn something procedural, it's difficult to change it. So typing on a keyboard, for example, is something that takes quite a long time to learn. But once you've learned it, you can type away and you don't need to think that much. But if someone changed the keys around on a keyboard, then you would really struggle because it cannot really reset itself very quickly. Now, some people, they really prefer declarative learning, talking about something, explaining it, whereas other people prefer more doing things, using their hands, just getting practice. But the best learning actually happens when you do both of these. And that's because the declarative learning, that will give you this understanding of it and this analytical framework that you can use to also analyze completely new situations, see where your approach might be wrong. Whereas procedural learning is important for speed and for efficiency of things. Okay, let's see if the distinction between these two are clear. Let's give you another small activity. Let's say that a person is handing over his bank card to his wife, and his wife asks for his PIN code, and he cannot remember it. But if he has the number pad in front of him, he can put in the right PIN code with his hand, but he can't really tell her in digits what it is. In this instance, has this person learned, is this PIN code stored declaratively or procedurally in this person's mind? Let's send a poll. Let's see. All right, can give it 3 more seconds. 3, 2, 1, and end. All right, and if we share the results, So if you have a hard time talking about what you know or explaining it, but you know how to do it, you generally have learned something procedurally. Of course, initially you might have learned something declaratively, but then you've only been using it procedurally for a long time. So those declarative links have withered away. So in this case, it will be mainly the procedural part of long-term memory where this pin code is stored. All right. And this is also, I remember this from when I was learning how to sail, that, you know, you can learn the principles of how the wind should hit the sail and all the things that you should do. But in the beginning, you're quite slow at all of this because you have to remind yourself of all these principles. Whereas when you've been out on a boat day in and day out and you've trimmed the sail, it becomes a part of you. It becomes internalized, and you can just move around the boat quite quickly. And if there's a lot of wind coming or something critical happens, you can quickly turn around and do the right thing because you have that speed and ease because you've learned something procedurally. And it's a little bit unfortunate that there's been a shift in recent years towards declarative learning, that there's this idea that you don't need to practice everything a lot. You can look information up. And the only way that you really learn something is if you're able to explain what you've learned. So a de-emphasis on practice and more towards declarative learning, whereas procedural learning is very important to gaining that speed and efficiency. And here is something else very important, and that is that our habits and how we conduct our work day to day, that's something that comes from the procedural system. And we cannot change that or change our habits through only declarative learning, such as reading a book or attending a lecture. That might be an important start, but it isn't enough. So how can you learn better procedurally? Well, we've looked at a few techniques that are actually helpful for creating both sets of links, which is retrieval practice and spaced repetitions. And where some common ways of improving in learning, or some common ways that improves declarative learning, however, doesn't necessarily improve procedural learning. And that's, you know, getting good explanations, having good discussions, reflecting about what you've learned, case studies, all of that is great. It helps you build that deep understanding and ability to talk about something, but it doesn't build that speed and ease in whatever you're doing. For that, you need something else, and this study might be able to shed some light on that. In this study, students were learning to play basketball, and these were students who hadn't really played much basketball. And researchers wanted to find out how well these students could learn to shoot a basketball from about 12 feet or 3.5 meters in the metric system. And these students were all practicing this, and practice is important for procedural learning. But some students practiced only shooting from 12 feet or 3.5 meters. Other students practiced from standing there, but also a little bit closer and a little bit further away. And during these practice sessions, all the students were improving at around the same pace. But then some days passed by with rest and where the students weren't playing basketball. And when they came back after a little while then for the final test, researchers saw that those who had been shooting from the same spot, they now produced an average score of 1.93, whereas those who had varied the location from where they were shooting, they obtained an average score of 3.29. And this study is just an example of something that's important for learning well procedurally, and that is variation. So the keywords are practice and it's variation, and lots of varied practice is what will build these procedural links. And of course, when we're learning, many people prefer to just focus on one thing at a time. Maybe you are learning a new set of words, so you group them, or you're learning to solve a numerical problem and you focus on one sort and then the next. A better way is to mix things up so that you get more variation. That's also a technique that's called interleaving. All right, so to recap, today we've really been focusing on long-term memory and what happens there when you learn. And we've seen that neurons come together, they form sets of links, and to learn something well, you have to create these strong sets of links. And to do that, you can use retrieval practice and space out your learning sessions, and also let your curiosity drive you. Then we saw that there's actually two different locations in long-term memory and two different systems for creating these sets of links. That's the declarative and the procedural systems, and you should use both of these. Declarative through explanations, discussion, reflections, and the procedural system through lots of varied practice. Now, today's focus was on the long-term memory. Next week, we are going to dig deep into working memory, which also plays a very important part of learning, but often isn't understood very well. And that will be at the same time next week. So I hope you join me for that. If you're interested in learning more about how to learn like a pro, check out our online course or book. And with that, I'm happy to answer some questions. And let's see. So, all right. The first question here is, who is the professor at UC Berkeley that you mentioned in the beginning? Yes, that is a professor called Morten Hansen, and he has written a book called Great at Work that you can check out. That's that professor. Is there a limit to amount of linked neurons a person may have? No, actually there isn't. You have so many neurons in your brain, and you have all these billion neurons, and they have, you know, all these toes. And so the number of connections is so many that you never ever have to worry about running out of space or connections. You have more space in your long-term memory than you could ever hope to fill up. I think Google made an estimate once that if you read all the books in the world and all that information sticked and you put that into these neural connections, you would fill up sort of 5% of your long-term memory. So it's not a capacity issue. The challenge is making sure that those links are strong and that they don't easily break up. Then there's another question here. Retrieval, is retrieval the same as repetition? And not necessarily. Repetition just mean, you know, working with something again. But if you are, say, if you are reading something several times, or you're looking at something several times, you might be doing repetitions, but you are not using retrieval practice. Whereas if you're using flashcards and you're actively trying to recall from your memory every time you do repetition, then you're using the retrieval practice. So they're not the same. And of course, the best way to run repetitions is making them spaced out over several days. Does that link ever go away entirely, or does it just get weaker? So probably it weakens. It weakens to the point where it's hard for you to sort of activate it on your own or find it. There's you know, it might also depends a little bit, but it's true that there are a lot of connections that you make that just become so weak that they're inactive. But if you get exposed to it again later at some time, it will be easier to relearn it because you have some links that are there that you can reactivate. Okay. What effects do nutrients have on neurons? So that's a very good question. There's things that you can eat that will help you with your cognition and that will make you more focused. For example, coffee will give you, at least short term, it will increase your focus a little bit. But nutrition and learning is something that I'm really not, that I don't have deep expertise in, so I better skip to the next question. So is procedural learning also called muscle memory? I think so. I mean, every time I hear from everything I've read and heard about muscle from muscle memory, it's the same or very similar to procedural learning. Right. How does declarative and procedural relate to learning something physical, like dance steps? versus a conceptual topic. So if someone is demonstrating some dance steps to you and explaining why you are doing different things, then you are learning that declaratively. But once you get in and actually practice it yourself, you are learning it procedurally. So that's the quick distinction there. And when you're learning a conceptual topic, so the initial explanation and the logic behind it, that will be declarative. But if you use this conceptual topic again and again and in different situations and concepts, it will gradually become procedural, and you can use it much quicker and with much more ease than initially when you learned it declaratively. Can you give an example of a circumstance that draws on both declarative and procedural learning? Yes. So, for example, learning a foreign language when you're a grown-up. Generally, when you're a kid, when kids learn language, they use the procedural system, and they don't have the attention span to sit down and get a lesson on different grammar rules, etc. But when you're an adult, you typically do both. So you might learn the rules of grammar and how to conjugate a verb, and that's procedural, and that might help you when you're sitting writing an email. But also just getting that practice, traveling to the country, speaking to a native speaker, that builds procedural links, which will help you with fluency and be able to understand foreign words on the fly and to put together sentences quickly. Is it true that it's harder to learn as you age? Is there a reason? Well, so the procedural learning system is typically better developed at a young age, and especially for learning certain things, such as certain motor skills and languages. But the declarative system might actually have an advantage the older you get, because the more you already know, the easier it is to connect new knowledge to old knowledge. So if you are very experienced and you know a lot, and it might be easier for you to latch on things to your prior knowledge. But for your procedural system, that will probably be a little bit harder. Let's see, my English is not so good. Could you explain retrieval practice one more time? Yes, so the essence of retrieval practice is to retrieve knowledge from inside your memory, not just looking at information or taking it in or trying to input information, but searching for that inside of your own memory and letting it out. You can do that by teaching others. So you've read a book and then you're very enthusiastic about it and you want to tell a friend about all the main principles. Then you are retrieving that from your own memory. If you had a list in front of you with all those key ideas and you just read from that list, you would not be using retrieval practice. And there's interesting research showing that, or people often say that teaching is the best way of learning. And in research, if people are teaching as a means of learning, if those people have too many aids, if they have too many things to help them, they have an image that they can point to, they have a list of bullet words, you make it really easy for them. They don't learn that much from teaching. But if you don't give them anything and they have to draw from their own memory a diagram and they have to find out how to present this without any help, they learn it much better. And that's because they really have to use retrieval practice much more. Let's see. How does Kahoot tool help in learning? So the Kahoot quizzing tool can help you in different ways. It's a form of retrieval practice. You get a question and then you need to think of what the right answer is. And what I would recommend if you're using Kahoot is not wait until the options appear, but really think for yourself and think about what the right answer is, even when you don't have any cues. And of course, what Kahoot is very good at is making the learning experience fun and engaging, which is also important for learning. And that can be valuable if you are learning together with other people. Wow, a lot of great questions, and we didn't have time for all of them, but I want to be a little bit mindful of the time. It's 1:45 now, so Evelyn,
we could have time for maybe 2 more, and then
go on a little bit more, or should we call it a day?
Maybe let's take one more. Seeing which one is.
No response from Evelyn so far. Okay, let's answer a few more questions, and then we'll cap it. And there'll be another opportunity also next week to ask questions, so forth, of course. All right. So, how do you learn to memorize? Like memorize a song or a theater monologue? So, retrieval practice and spacing is a very good way to start. There's also a lot of other tricks you can use for memorizing. For example, you can tap into your visual memory. You can use images, or you can try to create these mental routes in your head where different images point to different talking points, for example. But you'll still have to think back to those images and use that as a help if you want to be able to really have fluency and be very comfortable at singing something or saying something. You just need a lot of varied practice. So if you have an important speech or a theater monologue, what I would recommend is practice, 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 but bring in variation. Don't stand in front of the mirror in the bathroom and do that every morning. Talk about this out in the open. Talk about this to yourself. Talk about this to your partner. Talk about it to your friend. Add in lots of variation. That will build strong procedural links.
Hey, Olav, let's do one more maybe.
What is how do the types of learning processes, visual, auditory, kinesthetic, play into declarative versus procedural learning? So I mean, in the past, people used to talk about learning style, and that it was very important to find out if you were a visual learner or an auditory learner or a kinesthetic learner, meaning that you needed to know if you should learn by taking in information with your eyes, your ears, or if you should be doing things. Since that, there's a lot of research that have shown that it's actually hurt learners to force them into trying to find their preferred modality, and that it will help if you can just combine all of them. Generally, whenever you do something kinesthetically, it's mostly procedural learning, whereas if you only observe something or you see something with your eyes, it's more declaratively. But if you do both of it, you do something, you use your hand, and perhaps you read something or you see something, you tap into both learning systems. All right.
Hi, Olav.
There's just coming more and more questions. I don't think I can ever get to the bottom of the list.
There's so many questions.
Thanks a lot for all the great questions and for all the enthusiasm. And hopefully I'll see many of you again next week.
Great. Thank you, Olav. That was a really, really great session. So with that, let me quickly share my screen and just give everybody the last takeaway. Indeed, I just want to recap on the fact that next week is part 2 of the masterclass, and please do not miss it because it's going to be as interesting as the one you just did. Then I want to highlight the fact that we have a Kahoot collection that Olav has created based on this topic that you can find on our Discover page, which means that if you log into Kahoot, and I'll show you in a second where it is, you can find it just right on the Discover page, and make sure to check out his full edX course on edX.org. So let me show you where it is. If you log into your Kahoot screen, this is what you see. Once you click on Discover in the top nav, here you have Learn Like a Pro in the middle of the screen, and you have the easy connection to the Kahoot here as well. So if you click on it, you find all the Kahoots that Olav has created on this topic, which is super cool. I'll stop sharing. And Olav, thank you so, so much for this. And I look forward to the next session next week because I learned a lot.
Great. See you then.
Thanks so much, guys. Bye, everyone.